Why the family fired Princess Leonor's nanny. The corridors of Zarzuela were quiet that morning. Not tense. Not chaotic. Quiet in the way institutions become quiet when a decision has already been made. A child's footsteps echoed against polished floors. A familiar voice was no longer there to answer. In royal households, even personal attachments yield to institutional discipline, because continuity is protected not by comfort but by control. To outsiders, the departure of a nanny can appear ordinary. Staff rotate, contracts end, families evolve, but this was not simply domestic adjustment. It was timing, it was structure, it was preparation, and that changes everything, because when the heir to the Spanish throne is involved, nothing is merely personal. Every presence around her is part of the architecture of the crown. Every influence is evaluated not for affection, but for alignment with the future of the state. At first glance, it seemed like a quiet staffing decision. But was it, or was it the moment childhood began to narrow, deliberately? Royal households operate differently from ordinary families. The household is not simply a home, it is an institution embedded within a constitutional framework. Staff are not only caretakers, they are extensions of an ecosystem designed to preserve neutrality, discipline, and continuity. This is the living thread of continuity. Princess Leonor was not only a daughter. She was, from birth, the designated successor under Spain's constitutional order. That reality transforms every environment around her. Affection is permitted, attachment is human, but dependency is dangerous. By the time Leonor's public appearances began to shift from ceremonial child to composed adolescent, internal recalibrations were already underway. The crown had entered a different phase. King Felipe VI inherited a monarchy shaped by modern transparency and sharpened by public scrutiny. Stability required precision, and precision sometimes requires subtraction. When that phrase circulates inside a palace, it does not describe emotion. It describes strategy. Spain's monarchy functions within a constitutional system where legitimacy is not absolute, it is continuously earned. Public trust is the currency of survival. In the United States, where executive authority is electoral, institutions rise and fall through ballots. In the United Kingdom, where monarchy remains symbolic yet deeply woven into national identity, stability is maintained through disciplined public conduct. Spain walks a delicate middle path. Its monarchy is both restored and modern. Historic yet scrutinized, every decision surrounding the heir is evaluated against that reality. A nanny is not simply a caregiver. She becomes, over years, a private emotional anchor. And emotional anchors can compete with institutional shaping. This is not cruelty, it is conditioning. Royal heirs must form resilience early. Controlled independence is not optional, it is cultivated. Around the age when Leonor's education intensified, when public speeches became more deliberate, when her posture shifted from child to constitutional presence, the household architecture tightened. There is always a moment, rarely announced, when the palace decides that familiarity must yield to formality. That moment changes the atmosphere. The deeper question was never whether a nanny was dismissed. The question was why the timing mattered. Because timing in monarchy is rarely accidental. By then, international observers were already watching the Spanish heir with interest. In the United Kingdom, comparisons to other young royals were inevitable. In Germany, analysis focused on institutional durability. In Canada and Australia, constitutional scholars quietly assess European monarchies as reflections of their own parliamentary frameworks. The shaping of an heir is never domestic alone. It is global signaling. Continuity is not abstract here, it is embodied in visible presence. And visible presence must project discipline. There is something rarely spoken about in royal transitions from childhood to adolescence. The inner circle shrinks, not because trust disappears, but because clarity increases. As Leonor approached pivotal educational milestones, including her studies abroad, the structure around her tightened further. Exposure broadened, personal comforts narrowed, distance builds perspective, and perspective builds sovereign neutrality. What remains unspoken is whether the decision carried emotional cost. Of course it did, but in constitutional monarchies, emotional cost is absorbed privately so that public stability remains undisturbed. This is where misunderstanding often begins. Observers search for scandal, they look for conflict, but monarchy does not survive on scandal. It survives on discipline. At roughly the midpoint of her adolescence, Leonor's role became less theoretical. Her oath to the Constitution would one day bind her to a political system she must never dominate, yet always represent. That tension requires careful molding. The mid-stage of her formation was not about affection. It was about insulation. Insulation from overfamiliarity. Insulation from dependency. Insulation from voices that could unintentionally humanize what must eventually become symbolic. There is an approaching strain that every hereditary system confronts: how to raise a human being while preparing an institution. The two objectives are not identical. This is the pressure point. And once crossed, there is no reversal. By the time Leonor stood before the Spanish Parliament to swear allegiance to the Constitution, the transformation was visible. Composed, measured, controlled, national identity is woven into these rituals. But rituals require rehearsal, and rehearsal requires structure. The removal of a long-standing caregiver marks a quiet line. Before and after. Before, a child shaped by warmth. After, an heir shaped by expectation. The point of no return is rarely dramatic. It is procedural. Once the institution asserts primacy over the personal environment of the heir, childhood begins to recede by design. In the United States, commentators sometimes interpret royal adjustments as personal drama. In the United Kingdom, the language is more familiar: duty first. In Germany, analysis frames it as institutional calibration. Across Canada and Australia, constitutional observers understand the principle immediately. Heirs are not raised for themselves. They are raised for continuity. And continuity demands discipline. There remains, however, a deeper mystery. What conversations occurred behind closed doors? Was the explanation framed as opportunity? As growth? As necessity? Those details are controlled, and control is the point. Monarchies that reveal too much erode mystique. Monarchies that conceal too much erode trust. The balance is deliberate opacity, enough transparency to signal integrity, enough privacy to preserve authority. This recalibration was part of that balance. But it also foreshadows something larger. As Leonor advances through military training, public engagements, and constitutional responsibilities, each layer of personal insulation will increase. The heir must not appear overly dependent. She must project steadiness independent of private anchors. There is a future risk embedded here. Modern societies increasingly value authenticity. Yet monarchy depends on symbolic distance. If that distance grows too wide, relevance fades. If it narrows too much, authority softens. Spain's crown walks this line carefully. The removal of one caregiver may seem small, but it reflects an institutional instinct: tighten before expansion, control before exposure, structure before sovereignty. Because one day, Leonor will stand alone as head of state. And on that day, the state must not appear to be standing on borrowed emotional scaffolding. The phrase echoes not as judgment, but as doctrine. In royal households, even personal attachments yield to institutional discipline, because continuity is protected not by comfort, but by control. The world will continue to watch. The United States will analyze stability. The United Kingdom will compare precedent. Canada and Australia will consider constitutional symbolism. Germany will measure durability. And Spain will measure something quieter: whether the heir has been shaped firmly enough to carry the crown without leaning on what once comforted her. The story does not end with a departure. It continues in posture, in tone, in the careful distance between the woman she becomes and the child she once was. Because monarchy is not sustained by affection alone. It is sustained by preparation. And preparation always asks for something in return.